Great Wednesday. Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing real well, King. As I always say, that my Wednesday morning, even if it's not going well, it gets better when I see you across the miles via the technology here. So I'm in a good place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's definitely those feelings are reciprocated as well. And as we like to get things started, the gratitude moment. I'll go first because I'm really in a grateful space. I would say not more than usual, but just I would say I'm tuned into the frequency of gratitude today fully. And so I'm grateful for my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, have sound mind. I'm grateful for the roof over my head. I'm grateful for my mother to be alive and still have sound mind and be able to engage and still create memories with her. I'm grateful for the learning I've done over the past 8 months of how to become a better owner of a dog,
Hmm.
which has helped me become a better, more empathetic person. Not having any kids, I realized you expect things to happen, especially from a person who's a system engineer. If I say it, I mean it, do it. But then you realize that humans and other living creatures don't work that way. You got to be a little more patient, a little more tolerant.
Yeah,
And the dog is definitely teaching me that. And I'm grateful for that.
yeah, beautiful. I love that analogy with the dog can teach us as you know part of my gratitude. I mean, I'll stay my standard fare here. I'm really grateful to have be living in a place that has. I've had indoor plumbing my entire life. That sounds almost laughable to some people I know, but I really appreciate it. Um, Pretty much all the food I want whenever I want it. That's a big deal on this planet, and I really honor that. And then just to kind of touch on what you said, the value of relationships with other with other living beings. Because if I'm open, I'm really grateful for what I can learn from others, including like I can see a lot of trees out that window right now. But the human beings in my life had a good conversation this morning over breakfast that was helpful to me see myself more clearly. And so the learning through relationship in the largest meaning of relationship, I guess you say, whether it's with a dog, that lesson helps you be better with humans. So I just completely agree with that. Grateful for all of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, why don't you set the context for us of what our discussion will be today?
Yeah. So for those of you who have not been here before, and even for those of you who have, we've been navigating the trajectory of this book, Healing America's Narratives, the Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And the tagline at the bottom there is Becoming More Fully Human. I wrote it. um, and we've been doing this since June of 2022. So we're well into our conversations about the book. And today we're in chapter 11 out of the 12 chapters. And chapter 11 deals with, given American history and American current events, what are some of the things we can do as individuals and collectively in groups to begin to heal our narratives and recognize, own, and integrate our shadow, those parts of us that we deny or don't know are there. And I offer 7 statements and questions in chapter 11 that help that exploration. And we're on the fourth one today, and it's actually the one that ties directly into shadow. And so the question basically is, this is a daily practice I've had for um, not that long, probably a few years, but that's not that long because of my age. um, but the question is pretty simple: what am I missing? You can say that in different ways. What might I not be seeing? So anything like that. And it's not in the context, especially for somebody who doesn't have a good self-image or a lot of self-compassion to begin with. It's not in the context of I'm a bad person, I'm not seeing enough, I need to see more. It's just in the context of, okay, given where I am with my work, with my family, with my friends, with my relationship to the world, yeah, what might there be that I don't currently see, that if I did see it, would give me a broader, deeper, more integrated view of myself, others, and the world. So that's the tone or the flavor or the quality of the question. It's not a self, um, you know, beating question. It's not beat yourself up because you're missing something. It's all right. What am I not seeing? What am I missing? And if asked with integrity, without being self-critical and without being self-aggrandizing, it can be a really wonderful question. Um, Even as you were saying, because you've been using, you're working with, your dog, um, over many of our episodes. So the learning there, and I'm projecting this onto you, I apologize for that, is, so what am I missing in my relationship with this dog? And my question is, in my criticism of how we are as a country now, which led me to write Healing America's Narratives, my intention was to really take as integrated, broad, and deep view as I possibly could as I wrote the book. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything that was relevant, and especially anything that was essential as the book emerged. And I feel comfortable that I did a pretty good job with that. But as anyone who's written a book knows, that once it goes to the printer and it gets printed and bound and it's put out there in the world, when you see it, you say, oh, okay, I could change that sentence, or I could change that paragraph a little bit. But generally speaking, the practice of what am I missing can lead me to explore my shadow as well. What is it that's there inside of me that I don't really see, or I deny that it's there, that if I did see it, own it, and integrate it, I'd become a more whole, more fully human being. So that was uh, kind of an expansion of the general question, but that's it. What am I missing? That's what we want to work with today.
I think that's a great topic for today. You know, and it immediately reminds me of a quote, and I'm forgetting who is the author of the quote, but something I never forgot, where basically it says, "We judge ourselves by our intentions, and others judge us by our actions."
Hmm.
And so, to that point of what am I missing, or what am I not seeing about who I am and how I'm behaving? And for me, everything comes down to behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like they said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
So people have great intentions. And I think that that's where, at least speaking for myself, I've gone wrong in my past. Is I have these wonderful intentions about meeting people and relationships I want to build and goals I want to accomplish. But then for whatever reason, as I at that point in my life, I wasn't as principle centered as I wanted to be.
Hmm.
And so I allowed myself the circumstances in my life to prevent me from upholding to those intentions.
Okay.
And I never looked at or considered, I didn't see the impact that those behaviors had on others.
Mm-hmm.
I still felt, well, I'm a great person. I'm a good person. I still see myself in a good position. I don't have hate in my heart. I don't do bad things. So, you know, and I never looked at what, as Stephen R. Covey talks about, having those emotional withdrawals did to those other individuals.
Yeah.
So I think asking that question again, that's why I love the book, because we got to talk about, you should talk about narratives, you talk about referencing Carl Jung's shadow. I think all that's really extremely more relevant now than ever before.
Hmm.
And I'm sure that the book is written in a format, and I know that you talk about, you cite the historical significance of what's happened. It was always timely in a context that,
Yeah.
because it's about growth. It's about understanding who we are,
Yep.
and really beginning to look at, as we explore the question of how to become fully human, what do we need to do? You know, and I use this analogy real quick. The best thing about having a automotive machine apparatus is that whether it's an airplane, whether it's a car, it's built with indicators to let you know something's wrong. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm driving the car, check engine light. I need to deal with that. or I need to worry about transmission fluid. The car is smart enough to have those things, but we also have those indicators that we choose to ignore, and those are like the warning signs. It might be a pain that comes up. It might be when you continually attract the wrong people in your life, when you're wondering why do I continually keep tracking these people in my life, you know, and that for me is the crux of your question. It's a journey on a daily basis that I have to ask myself that deep introspective question: what am I not seeing? What am I missing as it relates to how I am impacting and how I'm influencing the world? Kind of were some topics we talked about last week. So I think that's a great topic. I just want to begin my comments with that.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. And as you spoke about some of the things you didn't see when you were younger, and you talked about emotionally closing down. That's not the exact word you used, um, but it reminded me of one of the big moments I had, a big insightful moment I had, and this is many years ago. Thank God it wasn't last week, because I'd be really embarrassed. I couldn't have written the book I wrote if I just discovered this last week. But it's the idea that at least I had this issue, and not, I'm going to assume that at least one other human on the planet had it as well. But there's this sense we have sometimes that all the people we meet, our family members, our colleagues at work, our classmates in school, our neighbors, that there's this big story about my life, my moving through my life to live with my, achieve my goals and accomplish my purposes and whatever it might be. And all these other people are players in my story. All right. That they're my friends, or they're my colleagues, they're my teachers, they're, whatever. I was a teacher for a while, they were my students, but it was all about me. And it wasn't so much that I was like egocentric, that I didn't care about things. I cared about them. But it was, and I was probably in my late 20s or early 30s when I had a really concrete thought. And some people might be laughing and saying, well, that's kind of late. But I just realized, oh, so King has his own story, and I'm a player in his life. I mean, I didn't know you back then, but
Right.
Marianne, who sits in the third row from the wall in the second seat in my literature class, like, she has his own story with her family. But and so all of us are both the stars of our own stories and bit players in everybody else's stories. And when we begin to look at that, when I began to then have conversations with people, rather than how they played a role in my life, it was more like, how are we playing roles in each other's lives, and how are we playing a role on this whole idea of life, capital L life, and capital E existence. And that just shifted my perspective. And again, it almost sounds goofy to say it out loud now, but it's a real big deal, because everybody is living his, her, or their own life. And everyone else either contributes to it or interferes with it in some way. And that recognition that it's not just about King, or just about Reggie, or just about whomever, is a really big deal in terms of that very thing you talked about, the impact of our behavior on other people, regardless of our intentions. And I tend to argue that both of those are important, but we have to look at both, because there's a big movement now. It's been there for some years, around the importance of impact, regardless of intentions. And I always want to bring the intention thing back in, because sometimes, especially in the last 10 years in this country, I think that a lot of people, sometimes a person who had good intentions and even behaved well, gets accused of doing something wrong because the recipient of the behavior has some issues of their own, and wants to blame the behavior that was done for the impact it had on them, where really the way they received it was the problem. So I don't know if that made any sense. Um,
Yes.
but the example is a lot of, young people, and I love young people, but, beginning in the middle 2000s, 2007, 2008, give or take, because of a lot of things in society and culture, they were overprotected by their parents for good reasons, but kids basically didn't learn how to take care of themselves in basic competent ways, and how to deal with a difference of opinion, even, or how to deal with the basic discomforts of argument with a friend, or subject matter in school that they didn't understand or felt uncomfortable with. And they got to universities and colleges, and they protested against subjects that they didn't like, because they couldn't be in a room where there was disagreement or their values felt challenged. So that's where, okay, most professors that I know have good intention. They love students and teaching. There's bad people in every profession. But they were being accused of doing bad things because they were teaching subjects that made some of the students uncomfortable. So in that case, the impact had a lot more to do with the person who was being impacted than with the intention of the impactor, so to say. So I think both of those are really important, because, again, the other side of it is there are other people out there who are well-intentioned and unskillful. And so they have really good intentions, and they behave in a way that doesn't really do good for those who receive the behavior. So both of those, I believe, are true. And part of my work, even in writing the book, was to be as integrated as possible. In other words, to be able to live in paradox, to say, okay, it's not just intention, it's not just impact. Sometimes it's one more than the other, but we need to look at both. And that's the very thing. If you look at our current polarization as a country, people on the extremes of the right and the left don't ask themselves, what am I missing? They're sure they know the truth, and they're sure the other side is wrong. And that's never a healthy. I shouldn't say never. I would argue that people who thought that Nazi Germany was wrong in the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s, they kind of were onto something there. And it wasn't like there were two sides to that story that needed to be honored. They needed to be stopped. So sometimes there is a clear cut, black and white intention and impact. In most cases, in day-to-day living, I don't think that that's true. So that's again, that's my bias, again, of trying to be integrated and hold paradox and not be wishy-washy, to be able to call out suspicious intentions or bad impact, but to be able to look at both before I call anybody out. And even, to use my own language, rather than calling somebody out, call them in to conversation and relationship. So I just caught myself there saying something. So, okay, I'm done rambling there.
Well, no, I think you made some great points, and I just want to add this to it before I want to bring up a question from one of our listeners. It reminds me of, Napoleon Hill, which is, a lot of people's favorite book, Think and Grow Rich. Definitely one of my favorite authors. He talks about the golden rule, which is treat others how you want to, how they want to be treated. No, how you want to be treated is the golden rule. Then remember Wayne Dyer said later on that he kind of altered that and said, no, it's not about treating others how they want to, how you want to be treated. It's about treating others how they want to be treated. And that's where, to me, to your point about how you can have great intentions, but the person who's being impacted may not like what you're doing as much as you think that they should, based on what your intentions are. Well, I wanted to bring up this question by Ryan McShane, and thank you for listening and writing this question, Ryan.
Yeah.
How does the book address false narratives pushed upon the populace, in which you spoke of briefly there, and being able to see beyond those narratives and defining your own?
Yeah, so that's at the heart of the book. I appreciate the question. So first thing I'm going to do is not push back, but comment a little bit on the question, which and I agree with the question, and I'm going to address how we address it in the book. But when you say, how does the book address false narratives? So I'm going to stop there for a second. The question I always ask, false according to whom? I ask that for any question, not just this one, because there have been people have been claiming false narratives for millennia based on what they believe to be true. But I understand I believe the intention of the question, so I want to go there first. In the world of developmental research, psychological developmental research, Robert Keegan's language really gets to the heart of this question, I believe. So, and I'm not an expert on his developmental model, but I know the language of it to a certain extent. And I would argue that many Americans live in a worldview that Keegan refers to as the socialized mind, meaning, and I speak about this in a book, I call it cultural givens, that the culture or society when we're young gives us a view of the world, and it's our responsibility to investigate that as we get older. Typically, that's a move we make in adolescence and beyond, I hope, to really say, okay, is this true? And just as an example, I was born into a world where the Japanese were bad people, the Germans were bad people, because World War II had just ended. So I'm old enough to have been, I was born in the mid-50s. Cowboys were good guys, Indians were savages, the Catholic Church was a one-two church. A lot of things I was given as a kid, which were false narratives. And I had to grow through them. And so to the point of your question, Ryan, is the next developmental level that Keegan identified. And this is all research-based, longitudinal studies. So he didn't just come up with an idea and say, here's what I think. So it's all ongoing studies. You move from a socialized mind, and this is the language you use, to a self-authoring mind, which gets, your question zeroes right in on that. To be able to see beyond those narratives, the socialized narratives, that which was given, and define your own. So for me, in my understanding of what you're asking in my own development, it's a developmental move. Even people who think they're independent, and I don't care if they're progressive. I do care. It doesn't matter if they're progressive or conservative. And in fact, I would even come in and say, let's ignore the extremes for a second, come into the moderate right, moderate left, where most governing gets done anyway. In my experience, even some folks there who feel as though they're independent minded, that they're self-authoring, even though they wouldn't use that language, they're still stuck in some cultural givens, or in your language, false narratives, because they really haven't self-authored, because it's like, the fish is looking around, so where's this water I'm hearing about? Culture is like that. And especially in a polarized democracy as our own, where if you're steadfast in your Republican views or steadfast in your Democratic views, even though you think you're an independent-minded person there's still some of that Republican culture or Democratic culture that keeps you swimming in that particular water and breathing that particular air. And then the last thing, which is too far into advanced, I think, for the average American right now, you can move from a self-authoring mind to a self-transforming mind, where you can not only tell your own story, but you can begin to transform yourself and your views. So to how the book addresses that, in chapter 1, I say, look at your own cultural narratives. Cultural givens is what the language I use. And then I define shadow, and then I provide 5 big examples of the shadow of America: history of women, history of African Americans, history of Native Americans, history of Vietnam, history of post 9/11 wars on terror. Then I provide some other examples of everything from climate change to violence, cultural violence. So I say, here's all these narratives, and we have this big narrative that America is the greatest country in the world. It's the beacon of freedom and democracy, and we see all of the evidence that hasn't been true historically. And so the book challenges the reader to say, okay, here's the narrative I was given as a reader from my childhood years forward. Here's a history of the United States. And again, the history is researched and documented. The book has 80 pages of notes, so I didn't make it up based on my memory of what happened historically. And then what King and I are dealing with right now, again, I'm still speaking directly to Ryan, to your question, is how do we begin to move beyond that? So even today's question, what am I missing? What might I be missing? Is a specific way to address what you're asking us to address, false narratives. Here's my narrative. I think that the 2020 election was stolen and that Donald Trump should be president. Oh, all right. What might I be missing if I really believe that? If I look at all 50 states, every Secretary of State, Republican or Democrat, every local voters registrar across the country checked, rechecked, again, Republican or Democrat, and said the election was fair. The person in charge of Trump's appointment to be in charge of cybersecurity for the nation said this was the most secure election in the history of the United States. I'm just using this example. And then was fired within 5 days by the president who wanted the election overturned. So that's an extreme example, denying a democratic election, but it speaks directly to if somebody genuinely asked, if the people who still think Trump won the 2020 election, if you genuinely, authentically ask the question, okay, what am I missing? And you look at all of the evidence, a reasonably competent human being can't think that the election was stolen anymore, unless all of the states, all of the secretaries of state, all of the voting registrars, both Republican and Democrat, I mean, probably no independents, but maybe there are some, unless they're all in cahoots to have a false election. And that's a fairly rational approach. You can apply that approach to anything. All right. Let's look at the evidence, but all of the evidence. Over 60 lawsuits were brought by the Trump administration. They won one which had no impact on the election results. All the others were thrown out by judges, some of whom were appointed by the president. So, in the face of these false narratives, in this case, obviously false narrative, being pushed on the populace, I like your language. How do I see beyond that? I have to pay attention to my own personal development. I have to play with language and questions and statements like, who am I really? What's my impact and what impacts me? And these are the questions that King and I have been playing with the last 4 or 5 sessions and will continue to. But I have to pay attention to my own worldview, what I believe, what the evidence is, and really interrogate the narratives, both that I hold myself dearly and those that are given to me from outside. In the absence of that kind of critical thought and self-reflection, there's a good chance that many people won't be able to see beyond their cultural givens and their false narratives in order to define their own and become self-authoring, and even beyond that, becoming self-transformative or self-transforming. So that was, I kind of went deep and broad there, but that I think that's my best take on your question, which I think is an essential question for everybody, every human being on the planet. But we're speaking primarily here for, those of us in the U.S.
I think that's a wonderful answer, and I just want to show Ryan's other comment that he made in relation to what our topic of today is, because I think it's in line with what your answer is. What I'm missing is a practice of circle dialogue that I teach companies struggling with communication. And I think that whether it's a company or as people, I think that's one of the things that we miss in school is how to communicate properly.
Yeah.
And because we miss how to communicate properly, then you combine that with the violence that we see in our movies, we hear in our songs, we see in the media. That's why most situations going to end in a violent way.
Yeah.
because we haven't been taught to really communicate properly. And so, within that being said, let me ask this question. Let me kind of go back to a question I really had when I saw what your topic was. And you said, "What am I missing?" Now, when you wrote the book and you really begin to look at a lot of those historical um, narratives that we talk about, would you say that in your research from which you already knew prior to writing the book, did it help you see things, I would say, more empath- empathetic with women, with blacks, with Native Americans? Did it help you see things that you didn't already have concerning empathy? In other words, going to the question of what am I missing? Did it fill in, answer some of those things and help you see clear from the research you did in preparing and writing the book?
Yeah, so definitely yes, and I'm just going to expand really quickly on that. So I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't already have empathy for myself and my family and my friends and my larger circle, but for people who you know um, who are not like me. I'm not a woman. I'm not Native American. I'm not an African American. I'm not a Vietnam vet or surviving family member of a Vietnam vet, and I'm not a family member of anybody who fought in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Although I do have friends and former students who fought both in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. So I went in there with some empathy. But to your question, I generally knew, kind of knew the history of women, Native Americans, African Americans, et cetera. By doing the research and reading a lot of the first person historical viewpoints, I learned, I got more deeply involved in to use your word, the empathic relationship with, what was it like for this little girl growing up in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 2000s, or this African American young man, or this Native American on or off the reservation. So I got increasingly more nuanced and personal insight into the kind of general truths I know of the horrific histories that I was writing about. So definitely my empathy was deepened, and just the number of I say this towards the end of the book, the debt I have to all of the writers and researchers and journalists and historians who have spoken to this. And what I want to do is, just because you showed me Shane's, or should be Ryan. I want to call him Shane because his last name is McShane. Sorry, Ryan. But this idea of struggling with communication in companies, and this is tied in, King, with your question. Now, I was actually looking for this in the book, and I know it's in there, but I don't want to be looking through the book as I'm talking. There's a wonderful quote from Isabel Wilkerson in her book Caste, when she's speaking about white folks learning that in fact they're not somehow superior to blacks. But she made the statement in this beautifully broad way, so it could apply to anybody who is suddenly faced with a challenge to a belief they've had for maybe their entire lives. And this is going to Ryan's question about being in a circle dialogue with people that are struggling with communication, even if it's business communication. Doesn't matter what the communication is. But if I have a firmly held belief, and it's gradually, because of the real world and evidence, there's all these little chisel hits. There's a hammer and a chisels coming in and hitting my belief, and gradually little pieces of it chipping apart and falling apart until it basically disintegrates. What happens is, suddenly I begin to question, not, oh, okay, I got that wrong. That belief wasn't true. So what am I going to believe now? But in Wilkerson's words, and I wish I could find the exact quote, it's about, so who am I if the very thing I've built my life believing isn't true? So it's actually a question of identity. So I don't know exactly, Ryan, I have a sense of what a circle dialogue is, but what really is helpful that sometimes when we're asked, not even when we're asked, when our beliefs are challenged, when our values are challenged, and especially if we're getting the kind of the inkling that in fact the challenge is legit and that the belief needs to be questioned and maybe let go of or chiseled away at or hit with a sledgehammer, it gets down to the core of who we think we are. And I don't know anyone who is willing to easily let go of identity. It's a really scary place to be. So I don't know to what extent that might be happening in these corporate circle dialogues, but we lock into our belief and we think it's who we are, and it's not. It never is. Beliefs are not who we are, but our whole identity is questioned, and that's terrifying to me, to anybody, as far as I know. So I think that's really important. And so it becomes, getting back, King, to what you were talking about with the empathy and my doing the research for the book, it becomes I can become increasingly more skillful the more empathy I feel when I'm speaking to someone, and either that person is challenging my beliefs or I'm challenging that person's beliefs. So the empathy piece is a big deal. So I'm trying to bring these things together. But for most human beings that I know, letting go of a cherished belief is a frightening affront to our sense of identity, and it needs to be dealt with skillfully and with compassion and empathy. So I don't know if I answered your question, King. But
No, you did. But I was thinking about your answer with changing your identity, and I also I put myself in the context of becoming more empathetic with concerns to the Jewish situation. When I say the Jewish
yeah,
situation, I'm speaking of like the Holocaust, obviously, and
yeah,
what I felt that the way I was raised, speaking only for myself, I read from books and scholars that always painted such a, rightfully so, the facts about slavery and the brutality we went through, and some of the things you mentioned in your book, civil rights movement, post Reconstruction movement, all those things, and what happened to blacks. And it was always from a context of we suffered the most. So how can someone else come back and say their suffering is equal or even on par with what we suffered in this country as black people, right? And I always had that belief, and I never understood how Jewish people would take so personal when people will come out and say something. They will say that's anti-Semitic. We got to deal with it right now. I never understood that until I read Viktor Frankl's book,
yeah,
and then that really opened my eyes and it helped me become more empathetic. Which is why I asked that question, because what I'm missing, right? And and he clearly, and I'm not going to quote him verbatim, but what he alluded to was the fact that no one's suffering is greater or lesser. Suffering is suffering. And when you look at it in that context, that's when it really hit me that I need to stop trying to judge a group of people by what they're saying and really try to understand why they feel that way. And then you look at, to go through what they went through, removing slavery and all my history and ancestor struggle, and just look at it strictly from their eyes, being empathetic, that when you have someone come in and just take not only your lives, but your riches, your everything from you, and you saw the conditions that are happening, you saw the language, you saw words being used in the media and how the media was used to create an atmosphere. Now I begin to understand why when you see something like that happen again, you're going to be quick to try to address that, because your natural reaction is to put yourself in a position that this could never happen again.
yep,
And we're going to use everything in our core as far as a group of people to position ourselves to never let it happen again. And so if we see it, just the inkling, the ember of what we believe is that kind of language, that kind of rhetoric, we're going to nip it out. And so now I understand it.
yeah,
Now, I might not necessarily agree that everything that's said is anti-Semitic, but I understand the thoughts behind why they feel that. I'm empathetic with that
yeah,
mindset. And that's where I had to question my identity. See, for me, I had to change from the identity of looking at myself as a black man, because as long as I looked at myself as a black man, I had to put everything in that view of what's happening and what has happened, and that group dynamic. And that's why I'm such an advocate now of, I began to see myself as more of a spiritual being, and as my journey to become more fully human, it's the individual first. I have to see myself as an individual, roll back and see who I am as king, and not just a name king, but as the individual king, as a man, as a black man, as a, my career as a system engineer, as a real estate developer, and all the different titles I've had, and become this spiritual being, as Carl Jung talks about, that growth of, statesman. I'm sorry, athlete to warrior to statesman, and then eventually spiritual growth.
Mm.
So for me, I wanted to change my identity because that's essential to growth.
Yeah.
It's like being that caterpillar and refusing to say I'm gonna let myself become a butterfly,
Yeah.
because I know being with a caterpillar, I'm comfortable being in the caterpillar's body, and I have no idea about what flight's gonna bring. When my wings break, will other birds eat me? I'll let myself become the butterfly, and only, not to say I'm a butterfly, but an analogy of transformation is where I'm speaking of,
Yeah.
and that's where I really feel as though, if you are on that journey of becoming fully human, you welcome the identity change, because it's a paradigm shift, and when your paradigm shift, you grow and you begin to think differently about worldviews and how you see people. And now I'm able to deal with folks without the bias of sitting down with you or someone like yourself and saying, well, Reggie, you're a white man. And then I'm going to hold all my, as you say, cultural givens against you, or
Mm.
personal. And I think cultural givens, and this is the question I want to ask as I wrap up my comment, because this is what I believe until you answer the question from how you wrote in the book. My my initial belief is your cultural givens, as you state, form your personal biases. Your personal bias are formed from your cultural givens.
Yeah.
And so, with that being said, my cultural givens and personal bias says that when I look at you and I see you as a white man, then every bias I have against white men, I'm gonna hold against you. Initially, you're guilty of that until you prove me wrong.
Mm.
But when I see you as, because I changed my identity, I see myself as a spiritual being, and my goal is to become more fully human. I see you as a human being first,
Yeah.
and I don't have that initial bias of you being a white man. I see you as Reggie and your spirit, your energy, and I resonate with that. And
Yeah.
then your whiteness, or your Italian more so specifically,
Mm.
comes in as more of a flavor to that, as opposed to the defining thing that I'm dealing with when I meet you.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with every piece of that. And in fact, and I want to go back to the thing you said about the suffering. Um, the difference between, okay, whose suffering is worse, whether it's anti-Semitism, or it's racism, or whatever it happens to be. And Stephen Levine, who's worked with the dying for years, a really interesting character, wrote a book called A Year to Live, and another one entitled Who Dies. But he made a really strong point. We just basically speaking about cancer, and it can be expanded into any kind of suffering. He said, when you are able to say it's the cancer as opposed to my cancer, so it's the suffering of the world as opposed
Mm,
to my suffering, suddenly you have this common humanity. Everybody suffers, they really do. Different duration, different intensity, different frequency, but nobody that I've met, I want to meet the person who hasn't suffered. And then it becomes less important about whose is worse, or it's like, oh, we're in this together, as you said. It's not, oh, there's Reggie, the Italian white guy, but there's another human being. So that's and that's the move. I mean, that's the move from socialized mind or cultural givens to self-authoring. Oh, I don't have to do it the way my grandparents did it, or say it the way the culture at large says it. Um, I can author my own story, and even moving beyond that. So That's the developmental move that we really need. And we want it to be healthy, because you can author your own story and be Hitler. You can author your own story and be, some other people in history that weren't so great. Um, but I agree with, I really resonate with how you articulated that in terms of your own growth. And then what I wanted to do, if it's okay, is just go back briefly, because I really wanted to give Isabel Wilkerson credit, because I found the quote that I was referring to, and it's I think it's 3, maybe 4 sentences tops, and it was in her reflections. And again, her book was Caste, Caste, for those who may not know of who she is in that book. And she makes the argument for a caste system in the United States, as she doesn't argue against there being a class system or a racial system, but she makes a real strong argument for caste, and she differentiates it. I'm not going to get into all the details of how she does that, but it's a wonderful argument. And in her reflecting on what happened in 1921 in the Tulsa, Oklahoma, race riot, or race massacre, as it's called, where effectively, because of a misunderstanding between a young black man entering an elevator and a white elevator operator, and people thought he had tried to assault her, and evidence is that it's clear that he didn't. But the white folks in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who lived on the outskirts of a part of Tulsa known as Greenville, which was called, in quotation marks, the Black Wall Street, because it was this African-American section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was wealthy. So doctors, lawyers, teachers, judges. I mean, it was just this beautifully built up, I forget how many blocks of Tulsa, a thriving community. And in 24 hours after this misunderstanding in this elevator, the local white folks burned it to the ground. And what Wilkerson argues really clearly is that the white folks who were raised to believe they were superior to blacks, again, think about these people were born in it's 1921, so they were born in the 1800s, a lot of them who are old enough, or older than 21, and they didn't know what to do when they saw black folks who 100 years earlier had been slaves having better lives than they had, having more success than they had. And so here's what Wilkerson wrote about that response, where the people on the lower rungs of the ruling caste, so the poorer white people, were looking at the people on the upper rungs. I know I'm frozen. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. We're looking at the people on the upper rungs of the lower caste, which were the blacks in America at the time, in Wilkerson's argument. And this is what she wrote. The natural human response from someone weaned on their caste's inherent superiority is to perceive a threat to their existence, a heightened sense of unease, of displacement, of fear for their very survival. And then she writes this question in quotation marks. If the things that I have thought, that I have believed are not true, then might I not be who I thought I was? End quote. And then she writes, the disaffection is more than economic. The malaise is spiritual, psychological, emotional. Who are you if there is no one for you to be better than? So that's from Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. And that's what we're speaking about here. And going back to Ryan's question, when our values or beliefs are challenged, now we're going to this extreme of the superiority, the perceived superiority of some whites that, in terms of their relationship with blacks. But it's true with any belief that if the belief gets challenged, what also gets challenged is the identity of the believer. Who am I now that this has been proven false? And in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921, the response was, violence, arson, and murder. In a horrible episode in American history. So the belief thing is really powerful, and the importance, again, to go back to Ryan's question, moving past that socialized mind or the cultural givens into a self-authoring choice of what I believe and who I am in the world is a really important developmental move. And we can see we're nowhere near it in the larger picture of America. If you look back to what happens every day in the U.S. Congress, and or even back to January 6th, 2021. Oh, I don't like the result of the election. I believe it was fixed. So I'm going to storm the Capitol, hang the vice president, and threaten to kill the Speaker of the House so we can overturn the election in the name of this democracy that I believe in. That's the irrationality of that kind of move. So
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that quote. I think that's definitely a very powerful quote. And you spoke about Tulsa and the tragedy that happened there. I've often looked at that as a context, and that's one of the things that when you really begin to study the history of where uh, terms such as white and black became used, because it wasn't always there throughout the history.
right.
It became used
Yep.
um, maybe around a 1600, 1700 time frame, and poor whites were given that by the elite whites mainly to say, and this is my summation, don't worry about not having money and being as successful as I am. You rest assured that if you don't have anything, you're better than blacks. So accept that as your saving grace. And the poor whites accepted that. And anything that challenged that to the point of Wilkinson wrote in that book was something they had to question their identity. Because if we're not better than blacks and we're poor, then we really have nothing, and that leads to despair.
Yep.
So if I'm superior to this other group of people, then I at least have that, you know. And I saw that throughout a lot of documentaries I've watched, books I've read in history, where, it was you're a white man, and that was supposed to be that itself was supposed to be your identity, and you need to be proud of that alone. But what I find to be really interesting, again, as I say, in committing to the journey of self-discovery, of personal growth, and that's part of the other podcasts I do with Dr. Kristen Eccleston, the growth perspective, where we talk about being committed to that process. See, that to me, and that's where to me, combining both of the topics podcasts, becoming more fully human, it's continued growth to become fully human is what is the process that we're looking for and the journey that we're on. And that's a journey that to me brings me more spiritual fulfillment. If I looked at my life, and I know others that I still know in my community who still identify first identity as being black, whether it's being a man or being a woman, then what you're putting on with that identity is the suit of victimness and racism.
Yeah.
And that's a heavy burden to carry. And I know I've carried that for years. And automatically, you're never going to have a great day. You're never going to have gratitude when you do that. You can't have a victim mentality and still find gratitude within that. Because then you're going to say, well, I could be grateful, but I need this, and this to change in order for me to be grateful. And for me, I couldn't find a balance. I didn't see the engineer in me who thinks with the logical thinking brain. I didn't see the value of continuing down that road of never being able to be happy fully and always looking for the racism in every single thing. When I began to see myself as an individual and understand systems and realize the systems are created to go against the group, not the individual. When you see yourself as an individual, even in the most racist times in this country, someone like Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and Madam C.J. Walker, all these great black business people, thinkers, were able to be successful despite all the racism that was out there, despite the hate that was filled within the country. They still, because they didn't operate as that group, they did things for the group. They didn't operate within the group mindset. They operated within the individual mindset. and they continue to look on the path of self growth, and they continue to see how by being that individual first, and that's what I always challenge people. That's what you almost have to roll back from the group thinking, become an individual, put yourself in a growth perspective, and then you can now operate within those groups differently, much more strategically, but at the end of the day, with love as your energy that you're emitting, and that's going to produce a different result. So, with that being said, we reached the time of the show. Which, Reggie, I want to give you the opportunity to. I know you still have a still picture, but hopefully your voice is still there, as you can kind of give us some ideas of what's next steps in discovering what I am missing.
Yeah, great. So I'm assuming you can hear me, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to just click on this, take the video off for a second, and see if it comes back. Yeah, still frozen. All right. So yeah, so I mean, it's probably the simplest practice of the ones that we offer.
I'm sorry, Reggie. I don't mean to interrupt you. You might take the video off because when you put back you take the video off, it shows that the screen's not frozen on both sides. Because then I got to constantly move to make sure people don't think we're both frozen. So you mind turning the video off? There you go. Because it gets
Okay.
a
Yeah.
pulsating away when you speak. Go ahead.
Yeah. So no, thank you for that. I didn't realize that. So it's this question. It's this simple. What might I be missing today? And you can even ask it in, it probably becomes more effective if you ask it in a specific context. So what might I be missing with my son or my daughter today? Might I be missing with my spouse? Might I be missing with my boss or my direct report, with my neighbor? Might I be missing with why my car isn't starting right? Whatever. It's more important to really ask the question, I believe, in the context, what might I be missing in how I see things in general? In other words, to what extent is my current worldview limiting me in terms of how I see others and the world at large? That's what we're really looking for here. So it's a simple question. Begin with practical things. What might I be missing? But it really is most effective and most challenging if it's asked turning back on myself. What might I be missing because of a false narrative, because of my cultural givens, because of my shadow, that part of myself I'm not aware of, I deny. That's where you really want to explore. And it's important to do it with compassion, self-compassion, not judgmental, I'm a bad person, but just to do it in a way that embraces your full humanity towards becoming increasingly more whole and integrated, more, as we say, fully human.
Excellent. Excellent. Now we reached the part we want to give examples of who we believe have exhibited the fully human behavior traits, whether it's past or present. And I'll start by saying someone that still has been a mentor to me since I moved to Baltimore. He was a great man. Him and both him and his wife I found to be very phenomenal people. His name is John Heron. And what I found to be, I mean, I can give a litany of reasons why I say this, but I'm going to just really give one example, and not excluding the kindness they've always shown me, but just kind of give you the example of what I mean. They moved into a new neighborhood about maybe 4 years ago, and after living in a different neighborhood for 30 years of their marriage. And again, John is a man that's in his 70s, was born, raised Catholic, Irish Catholic, and at 13 got out of the divinity school and kind of separated himself from a religious dogma, but still kind of kept his feeling of humanity and giving and being kind. So now here's a 70-year-old man, and he moved into a neighborhood that was very diverse, full of blacks, Asians, Indians, so it wasn't just one dominating race. And next door to him was a black elderly woman who had gone to the part of her life where she needed everyday care. She couldn't live on her own anymore. She needed to be put into her family moved her into an institution, but she still had a house. And what they would do on their own, and they still do, is go over this woman's house. And this woman was a hoarder, and just go through her things, because she needed to pay her rent and constantly keep paying her utilities. And they did this for her without her asking, and would go through her things that she had as a hoarder, package those things up, and sell those things online on eBay or whatever online website, and use the profits that were generated from that to pay her utilities and pay her bills, and continue to do that on a daily basis. So that kind of compassion is unrivaled from being kind and sharing love, because they're not getting paid. They're not taking a portion of her profits to say, well, I'm going to take 20% of her profits for my time. They give 100% of the money they make from selling her items online to cover her expenses. And that to me is the true definition of becoming fully human.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that example. So yes, so the person I'll name is somebody I don't know personally, and I was reminded because I heard him speak a couple of nights ago, and because he's had I think a healthy and a consistent message for years, and he's either loved or hated in the United States. Um, but he comes from a place of really honoring our common humanity. So it's Bernie Sanders. He, self-proclaimed socialist in a democratic capitalist society, but he's just so clear on the flaws in our current system with their inequalities, with the greed of an unhealthy iteration of capitalism, and the fact that as a nation we've accepted socialized interstate highway systems and roadways. We've accepted locally socialized public education, firefighters, policing, and yet the one place that we refuse to accept, again, socialized in quotation marks, is healthcare, where we could really do the most good for everyone in this country. And he just remains kind of a beacon for that idea of, with all of this wealth, why we can't take care of ourselves and others. And he's not arguing to turn the United States into a socialist nation. He's talking about using our wealth in a different way in order to care for people who need help. So I just have a lot of respect for his message. He'll never be president in his lifetime, but he keeps his voice in there to try to move the needle a little bit towards greater caring, I think.
I agree. Well, Reggie, I want to thank you again for investing the time and energy in writing the book, and for being a person that you are. These conversations, this show is definitely, I find to be insightful, invaluable, as well as entertaining in the context that I grow as a person, and definitely keeps me on my course of becoming more fully human on a daily basis. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you, King, for inviting me in and agreeing to keep playing together. This is wonderful for me, even though I'm invisible right now.
But your voice is there, which is the most important part.
Okay.
So I think everyone got value from what you're saying, or is getting value. I definitely encourage them to pick up the book, and let's continue to look at ways that we all can continue down the path of becoming more fully human. So, listening audience, I want to thank you again for listening to the Fully Human podcast. Until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., everyone continue to have a blessed and productive day. We ask that you subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the notification bell, and just like Ryan McShane, thank you for contributing and participating. Add your comments. We want to continue to build this audience and grow this momentum, and as we all explore what it means to become fully human. Thank you.